What's up, everybody? Welcome back to our Black History Nuggets. As we have been unpacking Black history from the Bible over these last several days, we are going to be unpacking Black History Nuggets from the Bible for this entire month of February. We touched yesterday we were asking the question, were the children of Israel really in Egyptian bondage for 400 years? And for as long as we have been in the church, we've always heard that the children of Israel were in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. But as we began to look at the text yesterday, we began to see that that belief that the 400-year bondage for the children of Israel, that belief may be founded, may not have a good foundation. Let's put it like that. Um, and so we're looking at the text that is often quoted, that is often used in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. In Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13 is one of the texts, is basically the main text that everyone uses to talk about how the children of Israel were in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. And we looked at that text, Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, and we also looked at Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40, it talks about how the children of Israel will be sojourners. They would be uh, in this land. Now, the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years, whereas in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, it says 400 years. And so we were trying to reconcile, where do we get these 400 years, the 430 years, which one is it? And so we ended yesterday looking at how in the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek Septuagint, it does not read just Egypt. It says Egypt and Canaan. For those who don't know, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Septuagint it is the Samaritan Pentateuch is the first five books of the Bible written in the Samaritan alphabet. And it was used as scripture by the Samaritans. And the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So, in those two documents, it says that in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40, that Egypt and Canaan is where the children of Israel went. Egypt and Canaan, not just Egypt. And so let's unpack this a little bit more, and let's see if the children of Israel were actually in Egyptian bondage for 400 years, or was it less? In Genesis chapter 46 and verse 26, it says, all the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. So everybody who came with Jacob was 66 people. All right, 66 people. Besides, of course, his sons' wives. Genesis 46, verse 8 says, now these were the names of the children of Israel, Jacob and his sons who went to Egypt. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn. The sons of Reuben were Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon were Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. I want you to remember that. Kohath. And the sons of Kohath were Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uziel. And the years of the life of Kohath were 133. So Kohath, who was in Egypt 133 years. Okay, so he lived, but he had 133 years. All right. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 20 says, and the years of the life of Amram were 137. 137. All right. So Amram was 137 years in, he lived for 137 years. Let's put it like that. Uh, so one of the sons that went in was Kohath. Okay, of the sons of Levi, one of them was named Kohath. And let's continue on. Well, we just read in Exodus 6 and verse 20 that Amram was 137, right? So 137. Moses was 80 years old, 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So you have let's Moses left at 80 years old, right? So Kohath was 133 years. He lived 133 years. Amram lived 137 years. Moses lived, well, better yet, he was born in Egypt and he brought them out at 80. So if you add all of those together, 133 plus 137 plus 80 equals 350. Check that out, 350. So you add Kohath's 133 because he lived 133 years. Now remember, he went in to Egypt and he lived 133 years. He didn't go in as a baby. All right. So he goes in, he lives 133 years plus Amram's 137 years plus Moses' 80, that equals 350 years. That means the children of Israel could not have been in Egypt no more than 350 years. Because remember, Kohath came in, Kohath came in, I mean, at we don't know exactly what age, right? But let's think about it like this. We know Kohath was not a baby when he went into Egypt. We also know he nor his son Amram lived their entire lives before having sons, which means that some of their time in Egypt would have overlapped. So it would have actually been less than 350 years that the children of Israel were in Egypt. Now we're not talking about in bondage. We're talking about just in Egypt. Just in Egypt. So we know they could not have been in Egypt for 400 years, which means they could not have been in bondage for 400 years. But then where do we get the 430 years? Where does that come from? I mean, if you're saying that they weren't in there for 400 years, and the text says they were there in Genesis 15:13, if it seems that to allude that they were there for 400 years, and then in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40, it says that they were there for 430 years. It seems to allude that. But what I just said before is in the Greek Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, it says 400, excuse me, it says Egypt and Canaan. But let's look at what it says in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16 and 17. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say and to seeds as if many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, in other words, from the time that Abraham received the promise that he will be the father of many nations to the time that he received the law after bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt. Okay, so how do we know that? Well, it says in Genesis chapter 12, uh, in verse 3 through 5 and verse 7, verses 3 through 5 and verse 7, it says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. So Abram departed as the Lord has spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Abram. So Abram was 75 years old when he received the promise. 75 years old, all right? Now, Genesis chapter 21, verse 5 tells us that at the age of 100, which was 25 years after receiving the promise, Abraham has Isaac. The text says, now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. All right? Now, according to, so 100 years old when he has Isaac, right? According to Genesis 25 and verse 26, 60 years later, Isaac has Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Afterward, his brother came out and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the 25 plus 60 equals 85. So the 20. So in other words, 25. So Abraham has gets the promise at 75. He has Isaac at 100, which is 25 years later. Then 60 years later, Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them, the text says. So, according to Genesis 47 and verse 9, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. 130 years. So when Jacob is 130 years later, 30 years old, 130 years later, all of Israel arrives in Egypt. Jacob says to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. So let's recap. Abram receives the promise. He receives the promise at 75 years old, right? 75 years old. 25 years later, he has Isaac. He has Isaac at the age of 100. 60 years later, Isaac has Jacob. Isaac has Jacob. All right? 60 years later, Isaac has Jacob. Jacob arrives in Egypt. Have mercy. Jacob arrives at Egypt at 130. So 25 plus 60 plus 130 is 215. 215. So 215 years in Canaan, 215 years in Egypt. So the children of Israel were not in Egypt. They were not in Egyptian bondage 400 years. They were in Canaan for 215 years, and they were in Egypt for 215 years. That's where the 430 years of Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40 comes from. That's why in the Greek Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch it says Egypt and Canaan. But I would suggest to you that the children of Israel weren't even in bondage for 215 years in Egypt. They were in Egypt for 215 years, but they were not in bondage for 250 years. How do we know that? Well, we'll unpack that in tomorrow's lesson. God bless.